if you want to kick things off.
Sure thing. Thanks, Jess. Well, hello, everyone, and welcome to our monthly installment of the Midwest Climate Adaptation Science Center's monthly science seminar. I'm Alyssa Welch, Program Manager for the Midwest CASC, hosted here at the University of Minnesota. A big welcome to those of you who are joining us for the first time today, and those of you who are already familiar with our work. And if you're new to us, just as a quick side note, we'll use the acronym for our Climate Adaptation Science Center, or CASC, throughout today's presentation. Note that the presentation is being recorded, so please adjust your video settings accordingly and mute your microphones throughout the session. I'm sure we're all used to doing that by this point. And if you have any questions for us or the presenter, please feel free to add those into the Zoom chat as we get going here. For today's presentation, we're delighted to welcome Lisa Webb to discuss her research on waterfowl in the Central and Mississippi Flyways, understanding changing distributions. But before we hand it over to Lisa, I'm going to provide just a very brief background on the Midwest CASC, and my colleague Jess Delfiaco, the Midwest CASC Communications Manager, will offer some announcements as well before the presentation. Next slide, please, Jess. The Midwest CASC is a partnership between USGS and a consortium of institutions across the region, hosted by the University of Minnesota, as you can see here on the map. We are part of a national network of regional CASCs, all of which work to produce science that informs resource management efforts, and fish, wildlife, water, land, and people adapt to our changing climate. Our work and the research we support centers around a set of science priorities from USGS specific to our Midwest region. Next slide, please, Jess. We accomplish this in several primary ways, as you can see here on the slide. Our consortium hosts synthesis research, conducts synthesis research on topics relevant to those regional priorities. We support a network of graduate students and postdoc fellows. I think this past year, or currently, we're supporting around 60 students. So we're excited about that, and we're starting to recruit for next academic year. We partner with consortium member College of Menominee Nation to offer a tribal undergraduate research program. And we host capacity building workshops in an annual gathering of our Midwest CASC community. We hosted our last one in August in Madison last year, thanks to those of you who are able to join us there. And we're just starting to get our planning going for this coming summer as well. So watch for more announcements about that. And of course, we also work with USGS to fund climate adaptation research projects and partnerships. In fact, in 2022, the CASC worked with over 27 or around 27 active projects related to those regional science priorities: heavy precipitation events and drought, loss of winter, altered hydrological regimes, novel terrestrial ecosystems, and barriers to and opportunities for adaptation. So with that, again, we're so pleased to have you with us here today and to hear Dr. Webb report out on one of these projects. Jess, I'll hand it over to you for those announcements.
Thanks, Alyssa. I've just got a couple of things that I wanted to highlight for you all today. One is that next month we are going to be hosting a equitable community engagement training for graduate students and postdoctoral researchers in the Midwest CASC community. So certainly if you are interested in learning more or registering for that, I hope you will reach out to Alyssa or I if you haven't received the invitation already. And if you're an advisor, please let your advisees know about this opportunity. We are really excited to have that coming up. We've also got a couple of job openings in our network that I wanted to share. One is a postdoc position at Indiana University, which is actually part of the National CASC Climate Adaptation Postdoctoral Fellowship Program. And then there's a graduate research assistantship here at the University of Minnesota. Both of those, information about those is in the newsletter that went out this morning, also on our social media channels. But again, feel free to reach out to us if you have questions or want to learn more about either of those things. With that, I think we are ready to go to our main event today, which is Dr. Lisa Webb. Lisa is an ecologist with the USGS Missouri Cooperative Fish and Wildlife Research Unit. And she is going to be taking over the rest of our hour here today. So Lisa, I'm going to stop sharing and let you pull up your slides.
Right. Hopefully you can all see a title slide that has some ducks on it. And thank you all for attending this presentation today, here to answer the perennial question of duck hunters everywhere: where are the ducks? This project, as just mentioned, is funded through the Midwest CASC and is focused on understanding changing distributions in the central of waterfowl in the Central and Mississippi Flyways. And it's not letting me advance, so that's fun. Okay. I'd like to start by acknowledging and thanking other team members on this project, including Dr. Bram Verheijen, who's a postdoc at the University of Missouri and funded through this project, as well as, and I should mention, Bram is taking the lead and doing the heavy lifting on a lot of the statistical analyses you'll see presented today, as well as team members, Dr. Mike Brazier with Ducks Unlimited and Dr. Heath Hagee with U.S. Fish and Wildlife Service. And in particular, I'd like to acknowledge members of the Game Bird Tech Committees for both the Central and the Mississippi Flyways. Members of these committees represent over 35 state, provincial, and federal agencies throughout the Flyways, and they're the ones who initially identified the need for this research in early 2019 as a way of addressing stakeholder concerns about perceived shifts in waterfowl distributions and the effects on recreational opportunities or waterfowl harvest, which could impact conservation at a continental level. Oh man, okay. So just to a quick overview of waterfowl migration. Most waterfowl species in North America are highly migratory, and this is an adaptation that allows them to exploit heterogeneous and temporally variable landscapes at large geographic scales. Migration enables the exploitation of these very seasonal and yet predictable feeding and survival opportunities in wetland ecosystems across North America. And it's important to note that migration behavior evolved as a trade-off or a balance between the costs and benefits that can influence survival and reproductive success. Consequently, the location, distance, and ultimate destination reached through migration can reflect a species' ecology and their life history needs and niches, with an optimization for the shortest distance possible while obtaining the maximum benefits of that migration pattern. And migration exists along a gradient or continuum. On one hand, you see obligate migrants, and these are species that have a very consistent, predictable, and reliable migration behavior in terms of when they depart, the routes they take, and ultimately where they end their migration. And recent work has identified a genetic component for many of these species where migration is almost hardwired into their DNA. In comparison, on the other side of the migration spectrum, there's facultative migrants, and these are birds that exhibit less consistent migration patterns, both in terms of whether or not they migrate, how many years they do migrate, the conditions that cause them to migrate, how far they migrate, a whole range of variables related to migration can change on an annual basis for these birds. But in general, they're thought to respond to environmental conditions. And so thinking about where mallards or waterfowl in general exist on this spectrum of migration, well, migratory behavior in waterfowl is often stimulated by photoperiod on an annual or seasonal basis. There's a lot of proximate factors that interact to influence the timing, duration, and distance of migratory waterfowl movements that ultimately shape their continental distribution, putting them a little closer to the facultative side of the migration spectrum. There have been several studies that have investigated what of these environmental conditions are related to waterfowl migration. This has been studied at a population level, where in Missouri, Schumer et al. Found a series of, or combination of weather variables were related to mallard abundance in the state, or lack of abundance, birds leaving the state. And then another study found that used radar data found that the weather encountered during flight south was kind of the primary driver of a lot of birds leaving an area and relocating. However, recent advances in technology have allowed us to look at migration as an individual behavior, which when scaled up can be viewed as a collective flocking behavior. And in last year, a paper came out that looked at satellite transmitters on mallards, and evaluated what the environmental drivers of autumn migration departure decision were for these birds. And so they specifically looked at weather variables and found that the main factors influencing when birds made these larger migratory movements were temperature. You can see that moving kind of left on that on the x-axis for temperature. As temperatures dip below zero, the probability or the utility of migration went up. As snow cover increased, probability of migration increased, and as the number of frost days in the previous week increased, migration probability went up. And so this found that, similar to those population level studies, what was driving individual level migration decisions for birds were snow and temperature. And we know that there's projected changes in climate, and particularly in temperature and snowfall for the Midwest. One study found that the Midwest winter temperatures are projected to increase 1 to 4 degrees by 2050, and that days with more than a centimeter of snow cover are likely to be reduced anywhere from 5 to 60 days in that same time frame. So given what we know about what drives mallard migration behavior and decision-making, and the projected changes to weather, has potential implications for changing environmental conditions to impact waterfowl migration, leading to increased foraging pressure in northern latitudes, as well as increased hunting opportunities, and also potentially leading to reduced foraging pressure at southern latitudes and reduced hunting opportunities. But one of the great things about studying waterfowl is that not only do we, can we project forward in what might happen, we have a lot of long-term data sets and enables us to evaluate historic patterns and changes, both in terms of environmental conditions and waterfowl distributions. So we know that over the past century, there have been changes in temperature, especially if you look at the mid to upper Midwest. We see anywhere from a 1 to 3 degree difference in difference in temperature, increase in temperature. And these trends are really driven by increases in winter temperature. Another study came out last year 2 years ago, I guess we're in 2023 now, 2 years ago that linked Christmas bird count data, which are done for all bird species, not exclusively waterfowl and not targeted to sample waterfowl specifically. But this study found that there were northward shifts in winter distributions for some waterfowl species. However, the direction and the extent of these shifts varied among species. Another great thing about studying waterfowl is that we have a whole lot of community scientists known as waterfowl hunters willing to sample them for us and collect data. And so we can look at sampling efforts that are specifically targeted, excuse the pun, at waterfowl. And so we found, a recent study looked at band recovery in mallards based on hunter harvested birds from 1980 to 2003, and found that there was no shift in their latitude or their location across this time frame. So we've got some somewhat contradictory results in terms of whether distributions are shifting and the extent to which they're shifting and for what species they may be shifting for. And it led us to wonder, or to think that, the last 10 years have included some of the warmest years on record, and wonder whether, maybe have some of the species that have already shifted north increased their pace or the range that they've shifted to. And also whether species that previously didn't show a response, whether they might be shifting north as well. So our research questions were, how have autumn and winter distributions for 15 duck species in the Mississippi and Central Flyways changed between 1960 and present day? And specifically, how have the centroid locations, size and extent of month-specific distributions of band recovery and harvested wings changed over time? So the data we used to evaluate or answer these questions included band recovery data from the USGS Bird Banding Lab. These are bands reported after marked birds are harvested. And the data time frame includes 1960 to present day, and the accuracy is at approximately 10-minute block. We also used wing harvest data from harvested birds reported as part of the parts collection survey administered by the U.S. Fish and Wildlife Service for the same time frame. The precision level of these data are slightly coarser about the county level, but still fairly informative. And once we had all of these data, we censored it to include only bands from birds that were banded in late summer and early fall, only bands and wings that were covered during the primary hunting season, September through January, and only bands and wings that were from birds either shot or that were found dead. So this gave us a sample size for both bands and wings for 15 species. The number listed above each species is the number of bands we had, and the number below is wings. And you can see that there's a pretty large range in terms of the sample size we had for different species. We have had by far the most data for mallards, followed by blue-winged teal and northern pintail. And we realized pretty quickly that because we were relying on data that was collected by hunters, there's a crucial link between band recoveries and wings and duck distributions. And the individuals who did the sampling for us ostensibly are bound by hunting regulations, which have changed over time, but not always in the same ways across in neighboring states. And so we realized that we needed to account for these changes in hunting season structure and ultimately sampling framework. And so we dug into the Federal Register and looked at how hunting seasons have changed over time and found that it's changed quite a bit. This image shows the hunting landscape in terms of zones in the 1960s. and compared to the number of zones in the present day. And so you can see that there's a lot more complexity in terms of increase in zones and in area, and how these areas can be divided up into specific hunting seasons. Zooming into one of our favorites to account for, Nebraska, you have to be very careful to make sure you're in the zone you think you are and adhering to the regulatory seasons associated with that zone. We also found the total area open to harvest has increased over the 60-year time frame, and most particularly it's increased in January. So it's not always that the amount of area open to hunting was the greatest in January, but this is the month that's seen the greatest increase in area. The number of days a particular zone is open to hunting increased, particularly from the 1990s into 2000. And then this figure shows how the number of open days have changed from 1960 to current for November. So you can see that the bluer an area gets, the more days it's open to hunting. So November, there's not a lot of, overall there's more open days, but not any real big changes. Compare that to December, and in the lower left corner, you can see what that it was in the 1960s. We start seeing more northern states and zones open for at least a portion of December. And a lot of these mid-latitude states and zones open for most of the month. And then finally for January is where we start to see the most striking difference. Southern states and zones are now open for most of the month, and some of the open states and zones in the north, especially in the central flyway, remain open through January, into January. And this means that the changes in the hunting landscape have consequences for our sampling and need to be accounted for. In particular, the mean latitude. So if you take the overall area that's open to hunting over time and calculate that the latitude of that area, or the mean latitude within that area, you see that in December, that latitude is increased by approximately 3 degrees over 60 years. And in January, it's increased by 2 degrees. And so we need to account for that increase and change it in the hunting landscape and the distribution of sampling effort over time if we're going to understand waterfowl distributions changes over time. So the way we did this, just as an example, we developed a correction factor, and we looked at, for example, this is the 2018 duck season, and the zones in Missouri, Louisiana, Arkansas doesn't have zones, but the uncorrected band and wing distribution showed a mean recovery latitude of approximately northern Arkansas, southern Missouri. However, we also know that each of these zones or regions was open to hunting and had different hunting sampling availability, different amounts throughout the month. So for example, the mid and northern zones in Missouri were open the entire month of December, whereas Arkansas was only open 24 days and Louisiana was only open 19 days. So to account for this unequal sampling distribution, the correction factor we developed was to include the number of days of the month each zone was open and available or allowed hunting. So for northern and mid-latitude zones in Missouri, this was 31 days and it was a correction factor of 1, so it didn't really change much. However, for areas that weren't open for the entire month, for example, Louisiana, we accounted for that, and the correction factor, it would weight any band recovered in this zone, give it a slightly higher weight to account for the lower sampling opportunity in that state or in that zone. And what that did was essentially shift the distribution of band and wing recoveries a little bit south because it accounted for the lower probability of or opportunity to harvest and collect birds in the southern range. And it's important to note that this correction factor, in this example, it's just a within year difference and allows us to account for a monthly difference in sampling potential across zones within that month, but it we were able to calculate this across years. And so there have been, as you saw from those previous slides, a lot of changes in terms of the timing and the area of where hunting occurs in different months over, across years. And so we're able to do this both within year between zones and then across years between zones. And so this really let us get at the second, it unknowingly became our first objective to quantify changes in the hunting landscape, which allowed us to get to our other objective was, correct for this sampling framework and answer how fall and winter distributions for our 15 duck species have changed from 1960 to present. It's going to be showing you a series of graphs that look like this. And these represent, we have the species on the y-axis, and anything to the left of that center line represents a shift south. Anything to the right of the center line represents a shift north. See, the circles are band data and the squares are wing data. And so for this first month, dabbling ducks, in the first month of October, we see that dabbling ducks tend to shift south, and diving ducks are shifting a little bit north from 1960 to present day. In November, most species are shifting south. But if you look at the overall extent to which dabbling ducks are shifting south, it's not very far. 2 to 50 kilometers over 60 years is not much of a shift. And so while it showed up as being statistically significant, it's geographically probably not that substantial. The diving ducks, however, showed a greater extent of southern shift in November, anywhere from 100 to 360 kilometers shifting south. In December, we see a flip, and most species are shifting north in December. And they're shifting north to a larger extent than we've seen in either direction for the previous months, anywhere from 150 to 230 kilometers. And then finally for January, we see dabbling ducks shifting north much further than diving ducks. But the trend is continuing in terms of that northern shift. And these represent data from an annual basis, and we did a linear regression models across all 60 years. But we were curious as to whether there were latitudinal shifts across decades, and wondering if are these shifts speeding up, or is any one decade when they made the big jump or shift, and then after that things have stayed the same. And so we combined data by decade to look at decadal shifts, and we also looked at broadly grouped all dabbling ducks together and all diving ducks together. So similar to the previous graphs, we see that in October, a lot of species or both groups are shifting south, with the exception of diving duck wing data, but that it's pretty comparable trends across decades. That there's no decade that sticks out as being really where a shift occurred. We see similar trends in November. In December, again, there's that northward shift for both dabbling and diving ducks, and start to see a little bit of difference. These are all in relation to 1960. I should have mentioned that some of these decades show greater shifts than others. And then finally for January, we see some of the more extensive shifts, but interestingly, these are for diving ducks more than dabbling ducks. So overall, we see fairly, in terms of trends in latitude, we see southward movement or shifts in distribution for a lot of species in both October and November. The extent of these, however, was not as substantial as some of the northern shifts we saw in later months. The northward shifts for most species occurred in December and January, and this is when we started to see the greater distance shifts. We saw a greater response by dabbling ducks compared to diving ducks for most months. And then we look at the decade patterns. We saw similar trends to shifts observed for just on an annual basis over the same time frame. But we did see that October dabbling duck locations tended to shift further south each decade. So it was a gradual shifting, as opposed to this is definitely the decade at which they changed. And then we saw diving ducks shifted south in November and north in December, and had no real trend in December. So again, that gradual monthly latitude shift for dabbling ducks was observed across these decades. And finally, I didn't present the results of this, but we did a couple tests just to make sure that our accounting for our correction factor and accounting for changes in the hunting landscape worked well. We modeled the distributions of the recoveries of the bands and found that for birds in most months, the distributions did come out to be normal. We weren't missing tails on either end of those distributions. And we do need to work a little bit more on our blue wing and green wing teal analyses. Those are confounded by some extensive changes in hunting season regulations with addition of early season hunting opportunities. So in terms of how our results compared to that previous study I mentioned that used the same data, just a shorter time frame of that data, the Green and Krementz paper that found no difference in latitude between 1980 and 2003. I mean, this could be because we've extended it, the time frame, and the years from 2003 to 2019 include more warmer years, and that might have contributed to us finding a pattern. But I think more likely it's because we broke the data up and looked at month-specific patterns that allowed us to see finer scale temporal trends in shifts in distribution, whereas the Green and Krementz paper combined all data collected from September through February, and that may have prevented them from seeing some of these monthly shifts. And I'd also like to emphasize that we do observe shifts occurring. Most of them are at within state scales. So for example, the biggest shifts that we saw occurred in December and January, anywhere from 230 to 340 kilometers for bands and approximately 200 kilometers for wings. North to south, the state of Missouri is approximately 513 kilometers. And so over a 60-year period, yes, we're seeing shifts, especially north in December and January, but it's at a within state level for most states. And then finally, we did see that dabbling ducks showed a greater response and pattern shift than the diving ducks during most of the months that we looked at. This could be driven by differences in diet. Dabbling ducks tend to be more generalist foragers and may be able to forage on a wider range of food resources, allowing them to stay further north or not respond to weather conditions as much, or it might be related to other life history strategies or even population levels. It also indicates that we may want to consider developing management plans that are specific for each group if dabbling duck response is going to be more extensive than, and shifts are going to be more extensive than the diving duck response. And digging into our third question, our third objective, looking at how these are just the latitudes. Now we wanted to look at the distributions and compare the distributions in the area and the extent of the month-specific distributions from band and wing recoveries over time. And so before we could do this, we needed to correct for changes in banding efforts. We considered, well, banding efforts occur on the breeding grounds, and these efforts can vary across geographic regions and across years. And so we knew we needed to account for this varying effort in terms of actually making the birds available to sample, putting those bands on in our analysis. And so we considered a couple different ways of defining the geographic origin of recovered bands, but ultimately we selected a combination of joint ventures as a basis for the subdivision because they have a useful alignment with both political and ecological boundaries. And so the specific subpopulations of band origination we looked at we combined in the United States, the northern Great Plains and the prairie pothole region. So those were considered birds banded from that region. In Canada, we combined the prairie habitat and the western boreal area as one kind of subpopulation of banding origin. And then we included the upper Mississippi River, Great Lakes, and Eastern Ontario as another subpopulation. And the reason we did this, that's the one I want, is that as I mentioned, banding efforts change over time depending on the geographic region. For the red line is the birds recovered in the prairie habitat and pothole joint ventures. And you can see a real peak in their recovery, or the number of bands recovered around 2000, and then it drops back off to the point where now more mallards are recovered in the Mississippi Flyway that originated from the upper Mississippi River Great Lakes joint venture than from these other two subpopulations combined. And so to account for changes in banding effort, we analyzed these subpopulations separately. All right, so I'm going to show you a series of figures. This is for our first mallard subpopulation. Areas in gray represent the historic 1960 to 1969 distribution. Areas in red represent the current distribution, or the distribution from the most current decade. And you can see that there have been substantial shifts in both the centroid and the southern extent of the distribution. Specifically, if you look from between these two decades, the northern extent really hasn't shifted that much, but the centroid and the southern extent have shifted between 2 to 3 degrees. And so this represents not only a useful visual tool for managers, it also allows us to really dig in and quantify where these shifts are occurring. So we can identify the area, compare the areas of the two distributions, and the current distribution is much smaller, or 1.5 times smaller than it was in 1960. We also see that approximately 20% of the current distribution was not part of the baseline or historical distribution, and almost 50% of the historical distribution for this subpopulation is not in the current distribution. So compare that to the mallards banded in the prairie pothole and northern Great Plains joint venture. We see they have not shifted nearly as much. And historically, their distributions were further north than the mallards from the prairie habitat in the western boreal. So almost no northern extent shift. And slightly, where we do see shifts, it's in the centroid and the southern. So they're not really shifting north the northern extent, they're just shifting out of the south. And then what I think is probably the most interesting mallard subpopulation is birds banded in the upper Mississippi River Great Lakes joint venture. Even if you look at the historic distribution of these birds, they were already wintering much further north than either of the mallards and the other two subpopulations. And where we see that their distribution, current distribution is approximately the same size as their historic distribution. It has shifted north and east to where, you know, 40% of it now occurs outside the historic distribution. And you can look at the differences in the centroid locations. That was just for January, but putting our 3 subpopulations on the same figure and looking at their centroid locations by month over time, we can see that there's some important insights that can be gleaned. In particular, the January and December, we see the greatest shift in centroid for those birds in the upper Mississippi Great Lakes region, whereas some of the other subpopulations, we see shifts in the centroid more in November, that blue line. The northern shifts occur very clearly for the birds in December and January, for the birds in the upper Miss Great Lakes subpopulation, but also to a lesser extent for the other 2 subpopulations. And then finally, the southern shift has not shown for all 3 of our subpopulations. The shifts in the southern extent are much smaller compared to the centroid and the northern extent. The extent of the upper Miss Great Lakes birds is further north, especially in terms of southern extent. And the shifts are greatest in December and January for our other 2 subpopulations. And then the amount that the current and the historic distributions overlap, looking at breaking these down by subpopulation and month, you can see that the overlap with space use compared to the baseline declined during all months. And so this isn't just a December and January issue, but that's where we're seeing the greatest the most lack of overlap. That doesn't make sense. Anyway, that's where we're seeing the biggest differences, but it's occurring in November as well. We see the smallest changes in overlap during September and October. And it's important to note that we're able to calculate not just the area of these distributions, the amount of overlap, but the volume. And so it's developing a map based on a 3-dimensional map as opposed to just area. So in terms of preliminary conclusions, most of the mallards, the months in which mallards are shifting north, we see pretty good concurrence on, even for across subpopulations, but we do see some variation in location and magnitude shifts in centroids and the extent of which they occur. And finally, just to emphasize that for most of these, the shifts in our centroid and northern location extent is much greater than the shift in the south. And just real quickly, I wanted to show that we've done a similar analysis for northern pintail. I won't go into as much detail on that. And we only have 2 subpopulations, the birds banded in prairie pothole northern Great Plains, and then the birds banded in the prairie habitat western boreal. You see for September and October, the current and historic distributions show fairly good overlap. Similar to November, where we see, you know, both historically and currently, birds, these pintails are making pretty large jumps between October and November. Where it starts to get a little different is in December for both subpopulations. We see current distribution extending north and east beyond the historic distribution, but still mostly overlapped with the historic distribution. And then finally for, well, oops. For January, some deviation from historic distributions for one subpopulation, but again, the prairie habitat and western boreal birds are, keeping their historic distribution and expanding their current distribution. And what this looks like, if you look at the relative area they're occurring, the northern pintail for both subpopulations are just increasing the area over which they're distributed. In December, almost twice as large of a distribution compared to historically, and in January, 1.5 times as large. And so overall for these, there's generally good agreement on which months the pintail are shifting northwards to the greatest extent, but we do see variation in response based on where birds originate from or their bands originate from. And we see that the changes, similar to mallards, the changes in the centroid locations and the northern extent are much greater than the changes in the southern extent. And finally, pintails are using a much larger area currently during December and January than they were historically. We also know that breeding pintail populations are at kind of record lows or much reduced in population. And so we've got fewer birds spread out over a much larger area, which may contribute to the perception that birds are, quote unquote, moving out of the region. So next up in our work, we're going to take these patterns that we've been able to identify in terms of distributions and distribution shifts and try and link these patterns to spatiotemporal patterns in weather conditions, start looking at annual and even decadal patterns in weather to look at how that influences distributions, looking at changes in land use, and then also changes in wetland inundation probability. There's a lot of wetlands out there, but their utility to most of these waterfowl is limited unless they are inundated. And we know that there's a lot of variation in that over time as well. And so looking at how these factors interact to influence distribution patterns is our next step. So with that, I'd like to thank the following agencies and collaborators for their support and contributions to this project. And if there's time, I'd be happy to take any questions.
Thank you so much for taking the time to share your research with us today, Lisa. This was great. I just want to say folks are welcome to either put your questions in the chat or you can go off mute and turn your video on if you'd like to just speak up directly.
I don't know what I just did there. Yep.
I can go off mute, so it's Olivia again. So it was really helpful to hear about pintails and sort of the population relative to the new distribution. Can you say something similar about the other species as well? Are they relatively stable populations?
I think pintails have probably shown the greatest, they're one of the species of at least from a waterfowl perspective, concern, and they've experienced the greatest decline in population. Some of the other species have shown variability. Mallards are doing great. Gadwall are doing great. Blue-winged teal are doing great. And so I think we're going to dig into some blue-winged teal distribution shifts next. They're another one of the species that we have sufficient data to try and look at these month by month patterns and shifts in distribution patterns for. So it'd be nice, provides a nice contrast for populations that are doing well and how they're shifting compared to populations that are perhaps declining.
There's another question in the chat that I can read out for you, Lisa. This is from Dakota Swisher. It's how have waterfowl or geese populations recovered from the avian flu deaths from 1 to 2 years ago? I know this was a huge problem at Lois Bluffs a year or so ago.
That's a good question, and I'm not sure I know the answer to that. Well, I know I don't know the answer to that, and I'm not sure that anyone does. They had, because of COVID, they were not able to fly the breeding population surveys for 2 years. And so there's gaps in our knowledge of how populations have responded to that, or populations have changed over that time frame. So it's tough to link populations in those years to avian influenza that was documented on Lost Bluffs or in any year.
And then I threw one more question in the chat. So when you're looking at weather conditions, I don't know, for waterfowl, is it cumulative days? So like you have 3 days of certain type of conditions. Are there more threshold type events that apply for them, or both?
I think it's a little of both. So for one study, it found that daily temperature had a sort of a gradual effect, that as temperatures decreased on a daily basis, birds would start to leave, but that cumulative number of days that went below freezing, just kind of met that threshold, would also contribute to that, or birds migrating. And so whereas snowfall, it seems like it's a much more immediate response, that birds they start snowing in, and that's a dichotomous variable where it's snowing in, they're out of there kind of thing. So it's probably a combination of both.
Yeah.
And interacts with the amount of, as I mentioned, wetlands that are inundated on the landscape on an annual basis, or even monthly basis, because some of those can change within a season, and the food availability that is on those wetlands. So.
All right, it's pretty quiet. Folks can still ask another question. Oh, there's one from Kim Hall. And I'll read it out here because it's in the chat. Have there been changes in wetland dynamics or wetland distributions that you have looked at already or might in the future?
That's a great question. We haven't quantified this yet. We know that with the Wetland Reserve Program over the past 20 years, there have been a lot of wetlands restored and put back on the landscape. The distribution of where that has occurred has not been uniform. And so some states have restored a lot more wetlands, or through the WRP program have had a lot more wetlands restored than others. And so, broadly, we know that trend is out there, but we're looking into quantifying both changes in the wetlands present on the landscape and their inundation or availability patterns. So yes, we think so, but I'm not sure exactly of the numbers just yet.